Good evening and welcome to episode 7 of COP28 Covered, the most listened to climate podcast of the moment, brought to you from the very heart of this climate summit. It is Tuesday the 5th of December. I'm Edie's publisher Luke Nichols and I'm joined once again by our deputy editor Sarah George.
Hello.
And as we reach the halfway point of COP28, Sarah and I are here to deliver up a very energetic special edition of the show, this time focused on the key theme of the day, that is energy, and we'll also be touching on yesterday's theme of accountability. We've got interviews with the World Benchmarking Alliance, Sustainable Energy Access Kenya and Reactive Technologies, plus another edition of the new popular segment of What's Hot and What's Not. And maybe we'll have time to run through our listener quiz of the day as well. All of that and more coming up in today's episode of COP28 Covered. Yes, welcome back to COP28 Covered, hosted in collaboration with the UN's Race to Zero campaign. And as you can probably hear from the background noise surrounding us, we're coming at you from a very much on-location site for today's episode, because we are sat right now at the epicentre of COP28, which is the Awasal Dome. This is the large dome-shaped sculpture that many of you will recognise from the various pictures, which have become, I guess, synonymous with this COP. Sarah, as recording locations go, this one's pretty spectacular, right?
I mean, it's absolutely stunning. They've been projecting different things onto the interior of the dome while I've been sitting there prepping my notes. We've gone from forest to quite an anxiety-making Black Mirror kind of high-tech option, and now we're going into some nice peaceful purple and stars.
Yeah, and I was out there this morning actually doing some work from inside the dome, and I happened to sit next to one of the people who designed it, would you believe, who was showing a load of people the architecture behind it and the work behind it. A guy from a firm called Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill Architecture. It wasn't Adrian or Gordon, I don't think, but he did tell me it's made up of 1,162 individual sections that were welded together into this shape, which is 130 metres wide and weighs over 2,500 tonnes, or the equivalent of 25 blue whales, if you happen to know how much one of them weighs. Anyway, spectacular location to be recording the podcast, which, Sarah, you'll be pleased to hear is rising up the charts. We're now at number 35 on iTunes for business podcasts and number 27 on Spotify. So thanks for listening in, everyone. Hopefully we're going some way towards helping you understand exactly what's been going on here at COP. And on that note, Sarah, we've reached the halfway point of this COP, assuming it all stays on schedule, of course. How would you describe your day 6 of the summit?
I mean, I was a bit miffed that you posted about half-time team talk on LinkedIn and then didn't immediately come into the kit room with orange slices and start applauding us for our set pieces. Yeah, I am missing the Premier League a bit being here. But day 6 has been a super interesting one for me personally, because I've spent most of my time in the blue zone. But today I've got a chance to really get out and about and explore the green zone, which is actually a lot greener. We're sat under some palm trees now, next to what looks like some beds of marigolds. This is all very handy for keeping out of the heat, sitting by something like this or one of the many fountains here. And it is all a bit more community focused here. This is where the non-state actors come. This is not technically UN soil, so it's been nice to just get out and about beyond bringing you today's interviews.
And the pink power suit is out in full force, which can mean only one thing. It's time for another edition of What's Hot and What's Not. Obviously today has been another huge day of activity here at COP28, with the themes of the day being energy and industry, the just transition and indigenous peoples. So Sarah's here to bring us a couple of the biggest announcements or developments of the day, followed by a couple of the things that perhaps haven't been announced or have sparked some controversy or backlash. So Sarah, what's hot and what's not?
Right, so starting with what's hot, the pink power suit. Obviously it's hot in terms of that I love it. It's also hot in terms of that it is boiling at 11 a.m. here, so it won't be making another appearance. It's going swiftly into the laundry. But on a more serious note, what's hot is always the debate about fossil fuel phasing out and down. So overnight / in the early hours of the morning, depending on what time zone you're in, the first edition of the negotiating text and the global stocktake text emerged. And there is an option for the text to include a fossil fuel phase out. That is still very much on the table. It is still to be fought for. There are, of course, other options, including a phase down, still that row over whether this is all fuels or unabated fuels. There's been some particularly early pushback from Saudi Arabia, which has said that it will sit in the negotiating room past time and fight against a text with a phase out included. But what's hot is that this is still on the agenda. Another hot topic today has been Indigenous peoples. It's a hot topic at every COP, given the extent to which Indigenous people have stewardship over biodiversity in particular, and the extent to which they could be impacted by fossil fuel extraction and other high carbon industries within their land, basically. So it's been good to see that this COP is playing host to the first Indigenous head of a delegation. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. Sonia Garadha, the Indigenous Minister of Brazil, is here heading up their delegation and gave her first speech today. The Ministry of Indigenous Peoples was created under Lula, so this is a fairly new creation for Brazil. So those are my what's hot. What's not is the continuing controversies over the fossil fuel industry's presence here. The Kick Big Polluters Out claimed today that there are more than 2,400 fossil fuel lobbyists here, and the Wall Street Journal is reporting that at least 600 of these people have links to the corporations that we all know and hate for expanding oil and gas, like ExxonMobil. For context, that's about 2.5% of the entire registrants here, but only 0.5% are scientists, according to the Club of Rome, and even fewer than this number are Indigenous people. So that's not hot.
Yeah, a mixed bag today. Wow, some shocking statistics there. Well, thank you, Sarah. All of those announcements once again covered on the ed.net website. Now let's crack on with the show, because we've once again brought to you a trio of interviews, all delivered by Sarah and all connected by the energy theme for this special episode of the show. So what have we got?
I'm going to interject there, Luke. So the first one, I'm actually setting the day by doing a bit of reflection on yesterday. I think it can be super easy to get swept up in the days here, to only find out about a day after it has happened. And so the first interview is all about accountability, which was the topic that was sort of shoehorned on the end of the list of topics yesterday, in my opinion. Obviously, it links to the energy part, because there is so much conversation going on here about how to hold nations responsible for the fossil fuel elephant in the room, how to hold these corporations responsible and set clearer guide rails about how they can and cannot be involved in COPs. But with all that said, our first interview is with the World Benchmarking Alliance's Executive Director, Gerbrand Haverkamp. Regular ED readers will probably know the Alliance for its regular rankings of businesses for their successes and failures, mostly failures, on big topics including human rights and climate. So we'll go to that first, if that's all right, Luke.
Absolutely all right. Let's go straight into that. So here's Sarah's chat with Gerbrand Haverkamp, the Executive Director for the World Benchmarking Alliance, in full.
Yes, so as we head into the 5th of December here at COP28, it's worth bearing in mind that there were multiple themes for the 4th, and our episode yesterday really honed in on finance, but the presidency agenda also somehow packed in gender equality, trade and accountability into that agenda. So I think the accountability part in particular is something that listeners are really keen to hear more about. So I'm delighted to have a bit of time with Gerbrand from the World Benchmarking Alliance to talk me through that. So thank you so much for your time. How's your COP going so far?
Thank you, Sarah. It's been a good COP. Let's call it. That's always a good COP, bad COP. It's been a good COP so far. Not everything is going as people wanted, of course, but that's never the case. But I think we've seen some good progress on the loss and damage and on tripling renewables.
Yeah, some big headline commitments made there. I mean, accountability has been the sort of other side of the coin. It's an area where the presidency has been criticised. But something I will say is that from covering previous COPs, I don't always see it as a themed day. So I wanted to get your view on whether it really is moving up the COP agenda, or whether having that themed day is a bit of a token gesture.
No, I think it's a lot more than a token gesture, and I think it's also really highly needed and timely. If we look at what the Secretary General has done, he has started a while ago with the creation of the high-level expert group, and they came out with a report a while ago on integrity matters, and it's basically setting out what a good transition plan and a credible transition plan looks like. The report is called Integrity Matters, and the Secretary General yesterday convened a meeting here at COP with organizations, with countries, to put focus on that report and how we make sure that as everyone is ramping up for these net zero targets, that we're not going to be washed away by greenwashing.
And we'll come on to corporate greenwashing in a bit, but I wanted to come on to the greenwashing that's on display in regards to the Paris Agreement. So we were told coming into this COP that national pledges to the Paris Agreement are actually aligned with 2.5 to 2.9 degrees of warming, and we've since heard a little bit on this podcast about how the Paris Agreement process lacks a built-in accountability mechanism. So without that embedded, whose role is it to hold countries to account?
Yeah, so because of the way that we have structured these COPs, there is no global government. We only have governance, so there's no one to enforce national governments to mandate their pledges. But what I think the Paris Agreement has done, it has moved climate into national politics. It's now the theme in major elections. And so it's ultimately, in the end of the day, it is now up to citizens to hold their governments to account. And because there are these national defined contributions, we actually have a standard that we can measure so that we know where the countries are on track, and then it's up to citizens to decide whether they're going to weigh that into their voting.
And I want to talk about corporate accountability here, a massively hot topic. So we've already seen businesses being called out for sponsoring the summit, doing consulting for the summit, doing PR work for the summit, and still working with high emitters or not getting their own house in order. And I wanted to get your view on how we can go beyond this immediate outrage, this immediate hot debate, and continue with this corporate accountability piece. And I know this is something that your organisation does year round.
Yes, I'm happy with the way that you frame that, because I think it's really, really important that we can't live from outrage to outrage. That's not how this is going to be. That's not how things are going to change. So what we really need to see is a much more fundamental articulation about not only what role the private sector can play, because we can all quickly agree on what that role could be, but we need to agree on what the responsibility of companies is. And it's really up to the UN to help us define what the responsibility is of business in us meeting the Paris Agreement. So we need to talk about government accountability, but most emissions are private, produced by the private sector, and that means that we need to start articulating what the actual responsibility is of companies. Because when we do that, it then allows people with influence over companies, whether that's regulators, whether that's investors, whether that's civil society at large, whether it's people working for companies, I think that's a very important group, that they then know where their company stands, and then they can take appropriate action. So of course measurement here is needed. That's what we as the World Benchmark Alliance do. But in addition to that, it's important that we also start to become much more articulate about what the responsibility is. Not what is just nice to have, but what is our basic expectations towards companies when it comes to moving to a 1.5 world. Which would then allow many more actors that have influence over companies. I've talked about investors, regulators, people movements, media, employees, to then use their influence over companies to ensure that companies are moving in that direction.
And we talk a lot about accountability in terms of holding the laggards to account, calling out greenwashing, but without accountability it can also be the case that those that are genuinely doing the work don't get the recognition they deserve. So what can you say about accountability in terms of actually highlighting who's really leading and disseminating meaningful information?
It's a very good point, again, because what we have seen is that there has been this perception that corporates don't want accountability. But we have to be very specific. It's the corporates that are not living up to the responsibility that do not want accountability. Companies that many of them you see here today as well are actually leading on this. They are making the investments to move to credible transition plans and to decarbonize their portfolios. And these are the companies will only get the rewards if we of course recognize them, but also if there's a penalty for the laggards, because they are taking risk, they are making costs that others are not making, and if there are no consequences for those that are lagging behind, then we're not rewarding leadership.
That makes complete sense, and I know you've talked there about that it's clear to set out responsibilities and expectations. I know there's probably a long list and that it will differ depending on what size of business and what sectors it's in, but if you could just give a very brief bit of best practice for people listening to action in their own businesses, what would you tell them to go away and do?
Well, I think if you want to make it general, then of course we want to see credible transition plans, which means that you have not only a 2050 target, but that you have interim targets, and that you are accountable, meaning that you measure and that you show not only your year-on-year performance, but also the capital that you allocate towards this transition, because it's going to cost a lot of money. An example that where this is clearly lacking is the oil and gas industry, where we see the long-term commitments, but we don't see credible short-term commitments, and we absolutely do not see the capital allocation that is required to make this transformation. I think the other thing that we increasingly are luckily seeing focus on is that we make sure that this is a just transition. This is not just about measuring what comes out of the exhaust pipe. We also need to bring people along in this, and that means dialogue with workers, with communities, and bringing your stakeholders along in this transformation. So the just transition is going to be absolutely vital.
And I couldn't have ended it better myself, because the 5th of December does have just transition as a theme on the agenda. So we'd better crack on and dive a bit deeper into that today. But for now, Gerbrand, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much to Gerbrand. A really interesting angle covered there to sort of set the scene, I think, for the next couple of interviews coming up around energy. So that segues us nicely on to that second and third interview of the show. So, Sarah, where are we going next?
Yeah, we're going back to back, and we're trying to go around the world in the energy transition in as much as we can do it justice in less than 20 minutes. So going to the Global South first, I spoke with Brian Omenyi, who is the coordinator of Sustainable Energy Access Forum Kenya and Power Up Kenya, and we had this great discussion about not only making sure that the energy generation mix is transitioned, but also that more people get access to clean energy, and not just in a tick box way. And then I also had a conversation looking at the sort of global north side of the puzzle, where the blockers and opportunities are very different. I had a discussion with two people from Reactive, which is working essentially to unlock grid capacity in markets that in developed nations. So I had a chat with Duncan Burt, who used to work at the National Grid, now works for Reactive, and also with Reactive's chief executive, all about those grid blockers that we've been hearing so much about in the run-up to this COP.
Yeah, two fascinating conversations to bring you now. Let's play them back to back now then. So first up, we'll hear from Brian Omenyi, who is from the Sustainable Energy Access Forum Kenya and Power Up Kenya. Then straight on to Mark and Duncan from Reactive Technologies. Let's play both of those interviews now in full.
Yes, so it is the energy-themed day in the agenda here at COP28, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that after walking so long in the heat, we'd be running out of energy, but that's definitely not the case. There are some great people here bringing so much insight, knowledge and passion about the global energy transition from all parts of the world. And I'm glad to be speaking with an expert from Kenya this morning. I'm here with Brian, who is coordinator of Sustainable Energy Access Forum Kenya and Power Up Kenya. So thank you so much for your time, Brian. How has your COP been so far?
Thank you so much for having me. As you said, clearly COP has been taking a lot of our energies, moving around, and definitely the interesting discussions that we're having, seeing the commitments that are being made, seeing actually even the commitment of the participants to really see to it that they add their bits and contribute towards the whole discussion. So we have been taking part in side events on different thematic areas, like today being the Energy Day. We're actually just coming from a side event that we are having in the morning that was looking at energizing resilience, looking at the interlinkages between climate adaptation and energy planning. So those are kind of the discussions we are having. We've seen a lot of commitments even from different development partners, looking at how we strengthen collaborations and partnerships between the different stakeholders to see to it that we are able to address the climate crisis. So it's been busy, tough, great, and we hope by the end of the second week we'll really have achieved quite a lot.
Yeah, and we can dig into hopes for the future in a moment, but because most of our regular listeners are in Europe, I think it's probably worth recapping about what is the current state of play with access to sustainable energy in Kenya, and how are the organisations that you with working to improve that?
Thank you so much. So when we come to the context of Kenya and maybe Africa at large, of course the whole debate on achieving universal energy access has been there, and we've seen a lot of commitment from the governments to put in place structures that includes policies, investment plans, and trying to engage stakeholders to see that we can be able to achieve the energy access by whichever targets that each country has set. So when we're talking about over 600 million Africans not having access to electricity, which is like 43% of the African population, that's quite a huge gap that needs to be addressed. When we come and narrow down to the Kenyan context, we are talking about 75% of Kenyans having access to electricity, which is quite significant, with 90% of the generation coming from renewable energy sources. So for Kenya, we've been doing quite tremendously well, but then we need to understand one of the challenges we have in Africa is, and even in Kenya in particular, is there's a difference between the grid actually passing through your area and you being able to access that electricity and make anything meaningful out of it. So you'll go to a homestead because electricity bills are quite high, so somebody is just using energy for the least of the functions, so like just lighting and charging devices, but they cannot use electricity for cooking, they cannot use electricity for heavy consumption like washing machines, refrigeration. This is because at the end of the day the bill is going to be huge and they are not going to be able to afford it. So we have to look at the elements that are really making access, total access to electricity not realized, so such as reliability, affordability, so that then we can be able to address the whole spectrum. So as Kenya, we are doing well with the plans we have. The current government is targeting to achieve 100% access by 2026. So I hope that can be achieved, although there are so many gaps that need to be bridged. And that includes reaching the marginalized communities in the rural areas, who are mostly the ones who do not have access to this electricity.
Yeah, we've heard a lot already about how access can't just be a tick box. A phone charger is not enough to run a hospital, run an enterprise, even keep a family healthy. So that's super important to cover. I also wanted to come on to the top line discussions that are coming along here on the energy transition. And we've heard a lot of concern about the sort of double speak coming from the presidency on fossil fuels, that they'll scale renewables, they'll scale access, they'll improve energy efficiency, but they'll also scale fossil fuels. So are you concerned about the discussions that are on display here?
Definitely it's of concern. So one of the things as Africa, I think we're really strongly pushing for this. We cannot have a clear and honest discussion about the whole transition if the developed countries, who are the most responsible for this whole crisis, are not willing to take the lead. So because for Africa, our emission is like 4% of the total global emissions. So really then our transition discussions are quite different compared to the other continents and the other countries who are really like the culprits of this whole crisis. So how do these developed countries take the initiative to take the lead? Because even when we're pushing for the total phase out of fossil fuels, it's not because we are the ones who are responsible, but because we are the ones who bear the effects of this whole genesis of where the genesis of the problem is. So how do we ensure that we are serious about this? I've seen the United States President committing to complete phase out of fossil fuels by 2035. We need to move from the mere words and rhetoric to action. So what sort of strategies are going to put in place to be able to ensure that we are able to achieve this? So we are in the United Arab Emirates, which is like its economy is entirely dependent on fossil fuels. So how honest are they to transition to other renewable and sustainable technologies that can be able to support their economies? Of course, we all have to appreciate the fact that for a transition to happen, we need to do it in a manner that is gradual, but also with the intensities that correspond to the level of the magnitude of the impacts that we are facing. So we need to have the clear commitments, and the commitments are not just coming from words, but we need to see resources allocated to it, and clear measures to follow up on honoring the commitments to the resources. We need to see the technology transfer. Africa is heavily dependent on developed countries for technology assistance to help them to be able to achieve the transition, because of course, in as much as we are emitting 4%, we are also facing, we are also having serious cases of emission from different sectors like transport. So we've seen the whole discussions about moving to e-mobility. So how do we ensure that we're supporting Africa not to, to be able to transition to such kind of technologies that are so dependent? We've seen our sectors like agriculture, which is largely dependent on nature and rain-fed. So how do we support our farmers, for instance, to access technologies like solar water pumps, solar refrigeration, cooling, to enhance production and also to cut down on post-harvest losses? So those are the kind of technologies that we're looking at, and also building the skill set and the capacity of our communities to be able to also to respond to the current issues we're facing.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of these top line commitments are on just generating the energy, especially through those big, massive mega projects. We've seen so many like multi-billion-dollar announcements from Mazda, but you've mentioned there's some really important smaller scale projects and actually getting access to that energy.
Yes. So definitely, so for the small scale, we need to look at how do we support the grassroots like communities who are like the end users and the consumers who are the worst hit. So when you go to Kenya, probably the discussions, for instance, for COP are for those guys in the cities who who are busy with day-to-day lives. But when you go to the rural communities, probably they do not understand what is actually going on here. And when you look at the intensities of who is the most affected, they are the ones who are actually affected by all this. So how do we get to attract investments that flow and trickle down to the grassroots? Africa only gets 2% of the total global investments in renewable energy, despite owning about 40% of the renewable energy resources. So how do we create an investment structure that allows finances and investments to flow down to national level and down to the local level, where the impact is supposed to be felt, and the resources are able to transform the lives of those communities?
I was going to ask about amplification. So essentially we connected through Ashton, which is an NGO based out of London, and you said that it can be hard for people that are, as you talk about, farmers or delivery drivers, people just working normal blue collar jobs in places like Kenya, to get to COPs, hear about COPs, understand how it affects them. So for people that are listening in London, how can they amplify experts from the global south and help support organisations like yours?
Thank you. So we appreciate partnerships like Ashton with the Power Up campaign, because we appreciate the level of networks and partnerships they have, the level of influence they have to be able to reach out to some of these big institutions who are able to then, through creating programs like the Power Up campaign, are able to influence finance flows to local and national levels that can then be able to create an impact to the local communities. So out there, we're calling on like-minded organizations, like-minded partners to join such kind of programs like the Power Up campaign that we are running, so that we can be able to use the networks we have, you can be able to use the partnerships we have with the global community to be able to mobilize resources that are going to support communities in the local areas in Africa that are really worst hit by the impacts of climate change, because we need to build the resilience of these communities. We need to help and enhance their adaptive capacity so that they can be able to withstand the impacts of climate change, because the reality is climate change impacts are there, and it's going to take quite a lot of time for us to recover, if at all we are going to achieve the 1.5 target. So before that happens, life continues. These communities have to still maintain their sources of livelihood. They have other socioeconomic dependence that they have to achieve. So how do we ensure that we are able to mobilize resources, and not just actually mobilizing resources only, but also influence policy development processes globally and regionally, so that you can be able to have policies that are able to push for the transition that we are calling for, and policies that are able to support developing countries or the worst hit to be able to respond effectively and support their communities to be resilient.
Yeah, absolutely vital stuff. And with that in mind, it's great that a theme for the day is just transition as well as energy. So fingers crossed that there are as many people in the negotiating rooms with such a grasp on the link between these two topics as you, Brian. But for now, I'll let you go and power up with a coffee or a juice. I'm sure we're wilting in the sun a bit. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great, so we're into the afternoon at the energy themed day here at COP. The sun is starting to set, starting to become a little bit less unrelenting, and I'm glad to be out this afternoon with two gentlemen from Reactive to talk to us about the challenges and opportunities of transitioning the grid in the global north after focusing on the global south in our previous episode. So I'm here with Mark, who's the co-founder and CEO of Reactive, and his colleague Duncan, who is their Chief Strategic Growth Officer with a wealth of past experience at National Grid. So thank you both so much for your time. How are you doing?
Really good, thanks, Sarah. As you say, the sun's calming down a bit and it's been a great day for us.
Yeah, I know you guys have just come out of a Changemakers event, which sounds very energising. So if we can maybe hear a little bit more about that and a brief introduction to Reactive.
So the Changemakers event was a COP-initiated recognition process to identify companies, typically from the private sector, who have got innovations that, if delivered at scale, can have a material beneficial impact to the net zero transition. And I guess where we fitted in, the announcement this COP has been around tripling renewable energy by 2030, so that means tripling the amount of renewables that are built, tripling the amount of renewables that are connected, and also, and where we fit in, is really tripling the amount of renewables that then run on the power system. And that's the challenge, where it actually has to make sense, and the grid needs to stay stable and secure in the control room, and renewables have a challenge to do that at scale in transmission grids, and certainly across America, Europe, Middle East, Asia Pacific, the rise of renewables is causing significant challenges for grids to continue to run as secure as they have been for the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah, and I'd like to dive into that a bit more. So just ahead of COP, the International Energy Agency published a great report on the need for rapid upgrades to the global grid, so modernisation and addition. They essentially said that total finance needs to treble, and we need to add as much new grid or updated grid as there is now. So what are the biggest challenges to doing that, and how can we do that at a lower cost, a more efficient way, and how does Reactive come into that?
Yeah, I mean, hats off to the IEA. They're doing some fantastic reporting, both ahead of and at COP. And I mean, the numbers are always large when it comes to investment in grids, but I think we should be pretty relaxed about it, because as the IEA said as well, what we're really seeing is a shift from massive investment in oil and gas to a shift to a massive investment in renewables and grids. And actually those two pretty much equalise each other out. But obviously that's a huge challenge for network utilities and grids around the world, distribution and transmission, and we are seeing that first in the global north with real hotspots in places like Australia and North America. Now, there are two really big issues. One is, how do you get those renewables connected? And then the second one is, how do you continue to operate that network safely and reliably once they're on? And Reactive's big role plays a part in both of those. When those grids are operating, you need to measure a whole set of new parameters to make sure that grid is safe. In particular, the inertia of that system or the stability of that system. And we provide, the key measurement technology to do that around the world, and we're now active, aren't we, Mark, around the world deploying that. And then alongside that, that measurement can help get renewables on quicker, particularly on distribution networks, where we can again provide that stability assessment for voltage and for the security level of the grid.
I wanted to get your view on how we can make sure that this is cost effective, because we're seeing some pretty radical stuff coming out in terms of what would be really ineffective and expensive. So a bunch of MPs in the UK are saying, why not just build a whole new grid offshore? And everyone with expertise is saying, well, that would be super expensive. So how can technology and measurement help us to deliver grids at pace and at low cost?
I mean, I think whenever you've got a problem or a challenge, the first thing to do is to try and quantify it. And what we're seeing around the world, not just in the UK, is that a lot of key decisions are being made with very limited data. So rather than actually understand the stability of a power system, an assumption would be made, and then investment decisions would then flow from that without the ability to actually optimize and to make better, smarter investments. So there's a huge rise in stability investments around synchronous condensers. We've obviously seen the rise of long duration storage, which obviously plays a role, but again, until you know the live stability of the grid, you can actually see that those could actually counteract and become more of a challenge for grids to actually safely operate within standard operating parameters.
That makes sense. So we're talking really about some of the nitty-gritty here that it would take to get that 2030 pledge, and obviously it's great to see that top-line commitment from governments here, but what do they need to do to flesh that out a bit and to make the considerations that we have talked about? What needs to happen beyond COP?
What needs to happen beyond COP? Well, I think there's always a lot of complaining at COP about promises rather than action, and actually the prize we've got today is actually about delivery and action. So that's the first big point, is recognising that delivery and consolidating it as it comes in. You know, Sarah, I'm sure every observer's got a list of 1,000 things that they would like to happen, but it really is key for governments now to really get behind, particularly the power sector and the EV sector, which is both now really doing the heavy lifting on decarbonisation to support that certainty of investment. You know, some of the changes we're seeing in the UK to help National Grid, the ESO now really drive those changes are fantastic. Seeing very similar policy changes in Australia to get ahead of the curve and anticipate what the grid is going to need in 2030, 2035, and at the same time support, you know, with the regulatory frameworks and the planning frameworks, all of that investment that's needed to get it on, because it can't come on fast enough.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard a lot about how risk managers aren't necessarily planning for things to get exponentially worse with the climate crisis, but we've also heard today in a tipping points report that people aren't really prepared for exponential growth in the good stuff that you mentioned, more renewables, more EVs. So fingers crossed that the nuts and bolts of that get screwed in to come. So we're nearly out of time, but thank you so much for joining me this afternoon on the podcast.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Sarah.
Well, there we go. Thanks very much to all of our interviewees, to Gerbrand, to Brian, and then to Mark and to Duncan. 3 fascinating conversations which stitched together nicely, I think, and gave us a great picture of what's going on across the energy space globally. So, back here to COP. Will this be the conference of parties that finally commits us to a complete global phase-out of fossil fuels? Only time will tell. But an equally important question that I'm sure is on the lips of most listeners, Sarah, is who is the winner of our rollover listener quiz from yesterday? So we have a £10 eco voucher to give away, and we've had quite a few answers come in for this one. Actually, people are desperate for these remaining vouchers of mine. So Sarah, remind us of yesterday's COP28 themed quiz question and the answer.
So this is from Health Day, which was indeed not yesterday but the day before that. I asked everyone which of the 17 sustainable development goals relates to health, and the answer was goal 3.
So it was 2 days ago, that question. Goal 3 was the answer. That winner is Derek Martin, the Sustainability Programs Manager at the University of California, Santa Cruz. A very well done to you, Derek. Our eco vouchers will be making their way to you shortly. Now, Sarah, on to today's question.
Yeah, so today's question comes back to the interview with Brian, so I hope you were listening carefully to what he had to say. The question is, according to International Energy Agency estimates, what percentage of global renewable energy investment goes into Africa?
Interesting question, that. So send your answers in to us at podcast@fav-house.com. And be quick, because we're going to go to the first person to email in on this occasion if we do end up with as many responses as we had over the last 24 hours. Right, I think that's it from us today, from another monumental day here at the Climate Summit for COP28 covered. Things are only getting louder and busier around us. Do reach out to us, everyone, if you'd like to meet up or have a suggestion for a future episode over the next few days, or just want to say hi. We're on that email address, podcast@fav-house.com. Sarah, what's coming up in tomorrow's episode as we reach the second half of the summit?
Yeah, so after our half-time break, it doesn't really feel like a break. The thematic agenda for tomorrow covers the built environment and transport, and if all goes to plan, it will be a transport special tomorrow covering everything from trucks to race cars. Fingers crossed.
Oh, that sounds interesting. Lots to look forward to. I'm going to go and see if we can maybe have a nice lie down. There's a few people lying down under that dome there. I don't know if you've seen that. We can see if we can do that before heading off for some dinner. We'll be back for that next episode tomorrow, 6th of December. And until then, it's a goodbye from Sarah.
Goodbye.
And goodbye from me. Goodbye.